Here we are at our second webinar in a series of sessions as part of our Education Connections project. This is an ongoing series of sessions on integrating the Common Core state standards for the education of English language learner and emergent bilingual students in secondary settings. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to see that some folks are here for the second time. We had Dr. Diane Stair-Fenner with us last month in January, and here we are in February, in a snowy February, with another expert we're really excited to have with us. Today we'll meet again for 1 hour and we'll end promptly at 1 p.m. We're pleased to be joined by Dr. Lynn Shafer Willner of M.Ed and its Center on Standards and Assessment Implementation. So for today's agenda, as some of you may recall from last month's session, each of these webinars will begin with an introduction and overview by members of the Education Connections staff, followed by a presentation by a guest presenter. During today's brief introduction to Education Connections, we'll remind participants of the key activities associated with the Education Connections project and highlight our monthly lesson planning competition, which is currently underway for this month, for the month of February, so we hope you'll join in. Join Education Connections at the link at the bottom of your screen. This link will be present for the next series of slides as I talk through the various activities associated with Education Connections. After this brief introduction, we'll hear from Dr. Willner, who will share some thoughts about the language demands embedded in the Common Core, placing emphasis on 6 features that strategically prepare English learners for the increased language demands in the core. Following Dr. Willner's presentation, we'll have a few moments reserved for questions and comments from participants. We'll be monitoring questions as they come in, and so we do welcome you to submit them sort of throughout the session as they may come to you. Again, we invite you to join Education Connections, and our monthly lesson plan competitions enable you the opportunity to win $100 if you submit the winning lesson, so we encourage you to think about doing that. We'll spend a few moments reminding you, for those of you who are not already members or who have recently joined, about their key activities, opportunities, and resources available via the Education Connections site. These are teachers working together for English learner success. Generally speaking, Education Connections provides for users free resources and a community of peers offering support and ideas for the implementation of the Common Core with English learner students. In particular, Education Connections hosts 4 key areas: professional learning communities, or PLCs, a repository of resources, regular webinars, and finally, lesson planning tools and our monthly lesson planning competition. To find out more about Education Connections, we encourage you to browse the resources available on our profile creation page. You can log into this page at www.obaverse.net/edconnect to view the login page. We also have resources available here, and there's where you can go ahead and create your profile today. Once you log into Education Connections via our Obaverse platform, you'll find various tabs that link you to the activities and resources available in the site. The PLCs are groups of users under the Forums tab that engage in discussions and share pointers, experiences, and expertise around implementing the CCSS for ELS. Under the Resources tab, you'll find a repository of resources that are currently separated into 4 categories: Basics on the Core, English Learners, CCSS and ELS, and finally Other Resources. Our webinar series are hosted by Education Connections. Will occur roughly every 4 to 8 weeks. For this one, we have a little bit tighter timeline in between. Depending on schedules, those may vary. These will always include an expert presenter and cover topics related to the core and standards implementation for English learners. And after presentations, these will always be archived. Finally, under the lesson planning under the Courses tab, you'll find our lesson planning section. Here you'll find information regarding generally about lesson planning, in addition to specific resources in support of our lesson planning competition. These include, for example, lesson planning template, a rubric to guide development and assessment of lessons, sample lessons, and information regarding principles of effective instruction for English learner and bilingual students. With that, we will move on to today's special presentation, which will be given by Dr. Lynn Shafer Willner, who holds an M.Ed. from the University at Buffalo and a Ph.D. in Multilingual Multicultural Education from George Mason University with an emphasis on multilingual multicultural education and instructional technology. Dr. Shafer is a Senior Research Associate in the Assessment and Standards Development Services Program at M.Ed. Dr. Shafer led the development of the CCSO's recently completed ELP standards, working closely with the ELPA 21 states to build consensus and gain feedback on the new ELP standards. Over the past 6 years, she has served as project manager for numerous ELL accommodation, accessibility, and data analysis projects for the 18 states who are supported by the Alaska, Appalachia, Mid-Atlantic, North Central, and Northwest Comprehensive Centers, and for the Park and Smarter Balanced Assessments Consortia. Much of her current work at M.Ed. is for the Center on Standards and Assessment Implementation, where she collects, reviews, and creates resources around the language demands of the Common Core. And with that, I will pass it over to Lynn. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lynn.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everyone for being here today. What I'd like to do today is share with you ideas and resources which you can use as you're refining and enhancing lessons and activity, and also selecting new activities and lessons. Right now, CSAI, the center where I work, we're doing a search for materials which trainers can use as they're working with educators around the language demands of the Common Core. So I've been talking to a lot of folks around the country and just looking at what they're doing. So today what I'd like to do is kind of pass that back to you with some of the things we're finding in the initial stages of that search. What we're seeing is that these lessons and activities, we're finding there are a group of lessons and activities that are qualitatively head and shoulders above the others. And right now we have an initial six sets of features that we're seeing in these activities. We're finding they emphasize use of language and context, connect with essential concepts of the content, they connect with the standards for practice, they emphasize EL interaction with other students, they provide broader avenues broader modes of communication, and they also include educative or formative assessment. So as thinking about this, you all have go-to lessons that we're doing. The question is, as you're enhancing and refining them, how can you do this in a way that's strategic and will provide ELs with the most leverage? There's not a lot of time, but what we can do, what can we do to help you on this area? So in this first area that we're looking at, we'd like to look at lessons that are talking about use of language forms and functions in context. And this is tied with one of the new shifts that we're seeing. Previously, ELP standards and instructions provided the foundation from which we would go and approach the instruction. So you would first learn English language proficiency, and then you would go and move on to doing content instruction. But now what we're looking at is a fundamental shift. And so language and content are being framed in parallel. So learning the language of the content is part and parcel of learning the content. And in some ways it's an issue of equity. If kids are being pulled from the classroom or they're missing out on the content, then they're falling further and further behind. So as we're looking at, ELs need more support than decontextualized vocabulary and grammar. So it's really about learning to use language in the context. So it's not having the decontextualized skills and strategies and vocabulary, but how are you going to put together and apply it? And this is a big change now because we're looking more at the functions of language, so the use of language and how it occurs in practice. So the instructional goals for ELs are focusing on how to support them and learning how to use language effectively as they progress towards independent participation in grade-appropriate activities. So the big emphasis is how can you use that language. It's not just a set of discrete skills, it's a social process. So English is seen as a resource for making meaning with different language choices available. And it's depending on whom we're communicating with and what we're trying to get done with the language within that specific context. So you may have seen this, but I want to point this out because at the secondary level, a lot of folks are very excited about the resources that have been developed and designed by Mary Schleppergrill and her colleagues at the University of Michigan. And there's a large Arabic-speaking population just outside of Detroit. And what they've been doing is looking at how they can increase student reading comprehension, content area understanding, and expository writing ability. They're examining what the text is about, how it's organized, and how the author's perspective is built into the text. So here's an example of one of the approaches that they're looking at. They're analyzing how definitions and explanations are constructed. So as you look at how to unpack the language of different content areas, with a science text, for example, students might need to learn how to recognize a common pattern in the way that definitions and explanations are organized. So here we see the key definition of mitosis is introduced and defined in a very long grammatical set of phrasing. Here's another example. And in history textbooks, they often interrupt a chronological retelling to discuss influences or present debate. So there's a specific language in terms of this context. And so one of the activities Mary has folks do is you're looking at these connectors of how you're tying together these different ideas. There's a lot of different modalities also in mathematics. So, and this is perhaps one of the most challenging disciplines linguistically because its meanings are being made simultaneously in the interaction between natural language and then mathematics symbolic language and the visual display. So classroom mathematics instructions moves back and forth between spoken and written languages in ways that require high levels of comprehension and engagement. So here's an example looking at the different ways that an equation is talked about in the classroom and presented in written language of a word problem. So the same meaning is made in three ways, but the language that ELs need to participate is very different in this example. There's very different levels that they're needing. Another strategy that we're hearing as folks are looking at how to impact the meaning of language in context is they're looking at the Core 6 strategies. And this is an ASCD publication. The Core 6 include reading for meaning. And this is a strategy around helping students develop skills to be proficient, effective readers and make sense of text. There's a compare and contrast strategy where you're conducting comparative analysis and you're trying to look deeper at the content. Inductive learning, which is a strategy that helps students see patterns and structures in content by using inductive processes. They have a circle of knowledge strategy where it's a strategic framework for planning and conducting engaging classroom discussions. And you're trying to help students think deeply and communicate thoughtfully. They have a right to learn strategy where you're trying to integrate writing into daily instruction, and you use writing skills to develop students' abilities to write in key text types. And finally, there is a strategy around code, looking at the code, the ability to retain and use academic vocabulary and grammatical structures and also discourse structures. So here is one of the top hat organizers that's being used. And so we're seeing a lot where folks are getting a lot of graphic organizers and using these with kids who have intermediate and above proficiency or even at the advanced beginner level, but helping them work through the different aspects in the content of the core, but also the language. And the goal is to try to get to the content at a much deeper level. So we're moving on to the next section. And before I move on, I just want to say if you do have questions or comments or you know of a resource that you really enjoy, please go and submit that into the question window, and we'll be sure to share that with everyone also at the end of this session. So the second set is we're seeing lessons and activities that connect with core ideas and concepts in the curriculum. So looking at these great lessons, here's another feature we're finding. And my colleague at CSAI, Joan Herman, and with Robert Lynn, she recently conducted an initial evaluation of the status of deeper learning represented in both consortia's plans. And this shows the depth of knowledge that are found in smarter balanced test items. And if we're looking at them, more than a third of the items are now at level 3 in terms of rigor and depth of knowledge. And when you think about this increased rigor, there's a lot of the conversation is talking about how it's due to the increased cognitive complexity, but there's this other aspect of academic language. And this is an important part to bring to the conversation between EL educators and general education educators, that it's not just about learning, the students just need to learn the content, but part of the rigor is that they really need to have support with learning the academic language of that specific content area. So let's take a look, though, at the language demands as you're going through the different depths of knowledge. So a problem that starts at, say, simple recall at depth of knowledge level 1, it's the language is around, it's very simple. Recall, draw, define, list, and label. As you move on to level 2, there's a little increasing complexity, but it's simple application. However, the problems that are coming out and the instruction that's coming out around level 3, you're asking students to do it's much more complex. You need to analyze, critique, synthesize, connect, and so the language demands that are connected with that are much more complicated. And then finally, as you get to this final level at level 4, it's even more increasing in its degree of depth and rigor, and the language demands are that much more that as students need to be able to extend analyses and investigations, synthesize and do analysis across multiple contexts. So one approach in the lessons that we're seeing that are really effective is they're taking a moment to really focus in on the core ideas and the critical details. And Edwin Ellis has a great way of saying this. He talks about watering up the curriculum. So you're really focusing on what are the key ideas that you need to be able for this content area. And there's definitely a tendency to simplify content instruction for English learners, and it's in order to reduce the language load on these students. However, doing less with the content does not lead to more gains in learning. So because of this, again, it's an equity issue, these kids run the risk of falling behind. So as you're building out and refining and enhancing your lessons, think about how your lessons and activities might provide opportunities to interact with the language of the core ideas and critical details of that content area. Here again, we go back to Mary Schleppergrell. She's got a great example of how to do this. She and her colleagues, they ask students to look at specific pages of the stories as they identify the important moments, and then with a partner, they're writing down the exact words the author uses. And this helps students focus on the key language they'll be working with, and it also helps the teacher see how the students engage with language. And this is an example from elementary school, but it can readily be adapted and used at the secondary level. And even if the students are copying in this area, it does give the teachers some good data for thinking about where further support for language development can be offered. A very popular approach as well that's being talked about a lot is been put out by Lily Wong Fillmore, and she's talking about taking some time and analyzing the juicy sentences found in complex texts. And in some ways, it's a different way to think about text complexity and celebrate the complexity that we're seeing. So each day, the teacher's selecting text to amplify as part of the instructional conversation. And I'm hearing this verb amplify a great deal in the conversations and in the way that folks are talking about complex text, taking a moment to slow down and really just telescope in or amplify that particular section. She's also talking about choosing text that has complex structure, but also that holds the essence of some of your lessons and activities and some really pivotal information. A lot of her examples, when you're looking on the web, you'll find examples, and they're more with primary school children. However, I'm showing on the page here, here's what a secondary school teacher did, and she was inspired by the juicy sentences, and then she started doing an activity around power sentences. Another area to think about when you're looking at how you want to refine and expand your lessons is looking at ways to connect to other lessons that have been designed in relation to the standards for practice. And I just want to take a moment and just look at a tool that's been used to kind of unpack the language practices found in the Common Core. And in 2012, a group of researchers from the Understanding Language Initiative and also from WIDA worked together to create a framework for English language proficiency development standards. And what they were doing is working together so that all the standards that are being developed can be framed in a way that we know we have the central types of language demands that will be needed. And the strategy that they're proposing is that you tie instruction related to student access to use of the practices. So it's a very strategic approach in some ways. By explicitly calling attention to these practices, analyses of language demands of college and career-ready standards can be used to cultivate higher-order thinking skills in ELLs and target their ability to comprehend and communicate about complex text. So in a way, this is a way to kind of jumpstart and jump to that higher level, but looking at how to identify these types of activities. And so what I would like to do is just look for a second at the standards for practice and kind of unpack, because what I'm seeing in classrooms, let me show you, I'm seeing when folks are looking at the standards, I see a lot of content area teachers who have been focused on just the standards on the right, the disciplinary core ideas or the domains. I also see in other classrooms where they're focusing not only on the domains on the right side of the page, but also the standards for mathematical practice. And it's a big difference. The classroom's focusing only on the domains. You see a lot of worksheets going on. The teachers are very concerned, how do I prepare for the next assessment? There's a lot of drill. But then in the other, where you see standards for practice being talked about, students are having opportunities to make sense of problems. There's talk about taking the activities, using tools, modeling them, looking for structure. So there's a much deeper way of approaching the content area ideas. And so the idea in the ELPD framework was to strategically choose how to go and create language access lessons that would correspond to these practices. So let me just show you again. Here are the standards as you see them with the science standards, the next generation science standards. Again, the core ideas are on the right and the scientific and engineering practices are on the left-hand side. And then there are also cross-cutting concepts. And then in the ELPD framework, what one of the writers did, Sue Pimentel, she went back to the Common Core for ELA, and she had been one of the primary writers. And because it had been published prior to the math and science standards, there had been no set of ELA practices. So Sue went back and she created a set of ELA practices, which they then used as part of the analysis in the ELPD framework. And so Tina Choik from Understanding Language, she went and looked at the convergences between the mathematics, science, and ELA practices. And so you may have seen this diagram, and Tina's going and looking at how you can go and just find the commonalities within these standards. So when you start reading this diagram and unpacking it, start in the middle and then work your way out. So the first part of this diagram centers around using the development of these are common content standards where you would develop a strong base of evidence to support arguments, claims, and statements. And so the idea is to think about what types of language would students be able to use as they're doing this. And sometimes when I'm talking to content teachers and they're saying, well, what do you mean about using language that's very esoteric? One thing that I've started doing is just say, okay, when you're doing this, can you go and say your lesson and can you say it in Pig Latin? And at first they say, what? And so can you respond to the lesson response in Pig Latin? And so they'll go and say, immediately they'll start thinking about, okay, well, here's how I'd say the vocabulary. But the challenge is to be able to use the language as they're doing this. It's one step further, and that's when you start getting into what is this language structure that I need to help my kids learn as they're learning how to use the language. So the standards for practice, for example, have a set of convergences around using models, developing and using models with mathematics, scientific, and computational thinking. In math and in science, what type of support could we provide to students as they use language to do these types of activities? Again, with the next set, students are asked with these types of practices, they're asked to take in the information, evaluate it, and be able to clearly and effectively communicate an appropriate response. What type of language do you need English language proficiency, do you need to have developed as you're putting language in action and making this and participating in the classroom discussion? What do you need to know when you're appropriately and strategically using technology and visual media? as students are using problem-solving strategies involving problem definition, modeling, precision, regularity of reasoning, there are several sets of language demands that if students are learning that type of language and how to use it, it prepares them that much more. It's a much more strategic way to help them be ready for the next set of participating in many other types of classroom discussions. What type of language do students need for defining a problem and completing, after they've completed the investigations? How would they analyze data, construct explanations, and design solutions? And finally, participate in classroom discourse around a wide range of topics and texts, including complex texts, coming to understand other perspectives. What type of language do students need, and how can we help them in that? So we see some common themes when you're thinking about the practices and the language demands across the Common Core. So students are being asked to engage with complex texts to build knowledge across the curriculum, use evidence to inform, argue, and analyze, work collaboratively, understanding multiple perspectives and presenting ideas, and using social language and academic language, a lot of different types of registers, and also use and develop linguistic resources to do all the above. So vocabulary is part of the picture, but it's getting to, there's a big shift, and especially in the understanding language work, where you're looking at how you're going to be using that language and the skills and structures to participate in classroom discourse. So as part of the standards that were developed for CCSSO, and these standards would be used by the ALPA 21 Consortia, we went and we took a look at that Venn diagram that I just showed you, and then we broke it down by the key functions. And so standards 1 through 7 involve a broader set of language functions and forms necessary for ELs to engage in central content-specific practices. They begin with a focus on the extraction of meaning, so right at the top, standard 1, and then they progress all the way down to engagement with these practices, so it's getting deeper. And you'll notice when we design these standards, we put the focus on linguistic forms and the subsets, we put those at standards 8, 9, and 10, because these are the more micro-linguistic features, and I think sometimes with instruction for English learners, there's a tendency to focus on the determined meaning of words, coherent and clear and coherent speech and text, making accurate use of standard English. So there's a tendency to focus on these aspects, and yet the use of language is so central to being able to participate in classroom discussions. So as you're looking through your lessons, I just wanted to point out, if you haven't already seen this, there are groups of lessons now being created in relation to the EQUIP rubrics. And one of the nice things is in this rubric, they're looking at the quality of lessons and their alignment to college and career ready standards. And one of the dimensions that they look at, they say align to the depth of the Common Core. And here they say on the left-hand side, standards for mathematical practice that are central to the lesson are identified, handled in grade appropriate way, and well connected to the content being addressed. And so these content area lessons, if you're seeing them, and they're a super place to start and thinking about lessons that can be chosen and then amplified in terms of the language demands. And the other day, I just came across a site that was built by Washington State, where they've gone through and they've used this rubric and 2 other rubrics to go through and rate several different sets of math and ELA standards at the high school level. And so I just found that. So this is another area, we'll put this in the final product, where you can go and find those lessons. Another place where you're thinking about how you might amplify these language demands, I love this. This is from the Academic Language Development Network. And what they're finding, they have exemplar units, lesson plans, and tools. But one of the things I like is that if you look in their toolkits, they don't have templates, they have toolkits. And so they give you a variety of different options. So as you're thinking about how you want to refine and enhance your lessons, here are some great ideas that you might want to pull from. And I also like that they're pulling, again, they're referencing the standards for practice as they're thinking about this. So they're in the process right now of filling out these toolkits. And we'll come back to the toolkits in the next section. So a very, very key aspect of the lesson. So I'm looking at videos that were created 3 and 4 years ago, and then looking at videos that of teachers teaching, for example, on the teaching channel. They have a nice set, and you look at them, and there's just a qualitative difference in the interaction that's going on. And so this is a really important feature for including in the lesson. And it's in terms of with these kids, how can you help them be involved in two-way interactive communication that involves negotiation of meaning? And you want to help them develop proficiency in sociocultural aspects of English. And this type of interaction is about moving from the sidelines and participating in what's going on. And one of the things, there's a really nice brief on the Center for Applied Linguistics website, where and it's by Rod Ellis, and he talks about the benefits of including output in lessons. And he's saying, when this happens, all sorts of good things, when you have output, all sorts of good things can happen. Students need to pay attention to grammar, test hypotheses about how English works. They're automatizing existing knowledge, and they get opportunities to develop discourse skills, for example, by learning how to produce turns in long conversations. So it's a really it's a nice way. So you're finding this, not only this emphasis on interaction and collaboration, you're finding it more in the CCSSO ELP standards that were developed for ELPA 21. You find it in California's standards, the new ELD standards. WIDA has aspects where you're really looking at the interactive communication. New York is also using this type of framework. And you can also, in fact, if you look over at your foreign language standards, if they're using the ACTFL foreign language, which is the American Council for Teachers of Foreign Languages, they're also using this type of, including in their framework, standards around interaction. Here's an idea that we're hearing some teachers really enjoying when they're looking for ways to specifically increase interaction in their lessons. They've been looking at Anita Archer's graphic organizers, and not only does she have some nice handouts, and I'm sure we can share these links after the webinar, but she also has some great videos that she's showing. She's just modeling how to go and teach class participation strategies. So she has, a lot of these are with middle school. And I've seen another set that she did with primary school as well. And coming back to the Academic Language Development Network, I like the extensiveness of their toolkit. As you look through the toolkit, they talk about ideas for whole class discussion, conversation modeling, exploration, math conversation, constructive conversations, and class discussions. So there are a lot of different ideas. So if you would like to pull from these different toolkits as you're thinking about where and how you want to go and amplify your own lessons. Finally, excuse me, in the fifth area, we're seeing oh, excuse me, let me just say, if you do have any questions, we see folks have submitted some, and so we will get to them at the end of the webinar. If you have any other questions, then you will, please, or comments or resources, please feel free to submit them there, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. So thank you. In terms of what do you do with the kids who are at the very beginning levels of English language proficiency? There's another trend looking at lessons that are using broader modes of communication. And even though, and in some ways, this is again, it's an issue of equity. So even though we know kids, ELs, will produce language that literally includes features that distinguish them from their native English-speaking peers, there's a general belief, in this framework that we're working in, it's possible for these students to achieve the standards for college and career readiness in terms of participating and providing, and so our job is to provide them with the broader access and create ways to match, give them communication modes that will match their abilities. So in terms of, regardless of the ELP level, all ELLs need access to challenging, grade-appropriate curriculum and instruction and assessment, and benefit from activities that require them to create linguistic output. So there have been a number of great approaches. Cal has done this SIOP, the Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. There's the Cognitive Academic Language Learning Approach. There's Guided Language Acquisition Design. There are a number of very effective approaches that have been used. But you'll find within these types of conversations, and even in the standards that you'll be receiving, whether you have the existing, you're with California and WIDA, you have those standards, or the ELP standards for Alpha 21 that are coming out, you'll see that we're used to and thinking about narrower kind of bands of communication, listening, reading, speaking, and writing. And in part, this is due to the federal requirements. States have to report their scores in these areas. And yet these new standards are trying to move beyond that and provide a broader mode for thinking about receptive and productive modalities. And this is important especially for ELs with disabilities. So how can we provide them with broader ways to participate in the curriculum, and also in terms of using multiple modes of representation, nonverbal communication, oral, pictorial, graphic, textual, signals. So how can we help all these kids participate in the classroom? So what I wanted to do at this point is talk about some of the intersection we're seeing between the EL community and also the Universal Design for Learning community. And I was just at a meeting where the folks from CAST, the Center for Assistive and Special Technologies, and from the Universal Design Center, they were there, and they were talking about the fact that, and they were very happy to hear. We had a nice conversation, and they were saying, can you pass on these messages that some folks still think of universal design as a technology initiative, or it's just for students with disabilities and intensive support. But it's really more of a framework for proactively designing learning experiences from the beginning. And it's enabling for all students so that they can gain the knowledge and skills and enthusiasm for learning. So I love what they talk about is they keep saying firm goals, flexible means. So we're not saying there's one way that you need to do something, but there could be multiple paths to achievement. So there's multiple ways to go and to reach your goal. And I think that the term that's often used is called equifinality. There's an equal, even though the ending is still the same, how you're reaching that may be slightly different. And one of the things that you'll notice in universal design, they're talking about multiple means of representation, various ways to acquire information, multiple means of expression, for learners to demonstrate what they know, and multiple means of engagement. So it's really getting into that, tapping into motivation, but also interaction and increasing motivation. And I wanted to share with you, there's a great paper that's out, and typically the reason why I like the paper is because it has examples, and it has lots of different places that if you're looking for ways to enhance your lessons and think about ways to include broader modes of participation, here are some great, there are probably 7 or 8 different pages with these different, just site after site, and different ways to help kids participate in the curriculum and foster that. So the big thing here is using in this area, in these set of examples, they're looking at how do we provide resources and tools that match students' abilities. Okay, and as the last, for those of you who are in Smarter Balance, you've heard this a lot, and we're hearing this more and more among all the different consortia and states. It's really coming back to the messages that talking about that were made very popular by Grant Wiggins and Kevin McTighe, where they're talking about educative assessment, and that is the use of assessment to inform instruction. So as you're building out your lessons, do you have a place in your lesson for some type of assessment or gathering information about what the students understand and then planning next steps? And just as a reminder, my colleague at CSEI, Margaret Heritage, talks a great deal about this informative assessment, reminding folks it's not a test or instrument, it's not a one-time event, it doesn't only happen at the end of the learning period, and it's not just something teachers do. It's a participation, it's all kids planning and helping and moving, identifying what you know and how do you need to go plan so you can move to that next step of learning. And Margaret likes to point out, this is a planned process. It takes place continuously during the course of teaching and learning, and it provides teachers and students with feedback to close the gap between current goals and desired goals. And she just thinks, she's like, this should be a key professional skill for teachers. So as you're building out your lessons, thinking about, do you have areas where you can plan for assessment, observe learning? What types of evidence are you evidence of learning are you gathering? What types of feedback would you like to provide? And there's a great phrase I remember as a teacher. It was like, feedback keeps you in the game. And so it's that feedback that you give to students, that's what helps them move to the next level. So this is just a quick way. Today they asked me to come in and give you some ideas as you're planning out your lessons. We looked at these 6 areas in terms of seeing the different resources and just how we can give you support. And so I've been kind of collecting different videos and examples and PowerPoints, so I'd love to talk with you more and just hear what's on your mind next. So Sarah, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lynn. We really appreciate all of your expertise and the resources and information that have been shared here. We have a couple of questions that Lynn and I have been looking through along with our other colleagues here. I want to give just a moment for those of you who have been participating today for you to submit other questions. So we'll just sit for maybe 30 seconds or so and let you think about whether or not you'd like to post other questions. And in the meantime, we'll sort of confer, and then we'll come back and answer a couple of these. Sure. So it looks like we've got a question here about introducing complex text to secondary English learners who are not reading on grade level. So this is something that Lynn is happy to speak to. The issue involves when we're working with English learners, of course we're all working at the secondary level, how do we introduce this really much more highly complex and some might argue use that word rigorous text that's required with the CCSS to English learners who may still be catching up to grade level. So Lynn, did you want to take that one?
Sure. What I'm seeing, the discussion I'm hearing among secondary teachers is the Schleppergrell resources have been fabulous in terms of taking a look at how to actually unpack and set up the activities that you do with the kids. And so she's using a lot with the graphic organizers and doing that way. Also the approach that with Lily Wong Fillmore about the juicy sentences. So it's identifying that central text within the complex text and taking time to unpack it. And a lot of times with Lily, some of her activities, they occur over 2 weeks. So they're taking one central area of the text and unpacking it. And then I want to go back also to the previous section, pardon me for the flipping through, but the Core 6 strategies, they've been extremely helpful. And then looking again at the Schleppergrell. Like when folks go and look at her work, she's got a lot of nice work in terms of how that is set out. I think that's a great place to start. Do you have a specific maybe you could type in some more if you have a specific content area too.
So sure. Another resource I want to also point out in addition to Lynn's thoughts, and thank you so much, those are really valuable. There is a brief that was written by some colleagues and some of our experts here at Cal who work in professional development. This is a brief on the implementation of the Common Core state standards for English language learners, and in particular, one of the areas that we do cover in that brief has to do with complex text and this issue of really how do we ensure that we're not compromising really rigorous content for English learners. That's a Cal practitioner brief, and it's called Implementing the Common Core for English Learners, Responses to Common Questions. That just came out this past September, and it's available at www.cal.org/resources. If you just do a search for Implementing the Common Core, you'll find that there. And there are some practical examples and strategies available in that brief.
Okay. But I mean, I think I hear that it's a good point that Anne was. Is it Annie? I'm sorry, I'm far from the board, so sorry, Annie. I think it's a good point, and so in our search too, I'll look for different more videos in that area. They have, if you look on the teaching channel, there, if you're looking for a visual model, Understanding Language has some new lessons that they've debuted on their own site. And when I first looked at them, I was only reading them, and they felt, I have to say, they felt very overwhelming. Like they're great, but they're using kind of the terms in a different way. And so I found that I first went and watched the lessons that they had, and I watched the videos on the teaching channel, so they have associated videos there. After watching those videos, then I could go back to the Understanding Language materials, and I think it was Aida Walke created the ELA lesson. But it was useful to get a visual of what it looked like by going first to the teaching channel videos. So, but you have to be careful with the videos, because some of the older ones, they haven't really moved to that higher. Mm-hmm. They're nice, but it's just, it's not.
Well, I think part of what we find, one of the challenges with sort of consuming videos that may be available on the web has to do with the fact that so this stuff is just so new, that we're grappling with how to understand how everything fits together and where certain pieces fit along with other pieces. And that brings me to sort of a valuable point and maybe question for Lynn. Could you talk a little bit about, for the participants who may be non-ESL teachers or just trying to get a sense of what's going on with the standards movement, can you give us some background on ELPA 21 and when do we expect to see ELPA 21 coming out?
Well, it depends on the state, and so the states have been adopting the standards. The range has been between October and to now, so it depends which of the 11 states you're in. So if you could actually let me know which is your state, I could let you know. I know some of them are ongoing. I believe Oregon, Washington State have already adopted, and then there's processes going on right now in the other states. And I believe if you're in West Virginia, they're doing a training in March on that and bringing those standards back to the districts. So if that's where you are.
Great, great. Well, one of the questions that's come in, I guess, is kind of more of a statement which emerged during the last session, has to do with resources and where these resources may be available for the future. So I would just turn participants back to the link for logging into Education Connections. This webinar will be archived on the Education Connections website. In addition to that, we will post not only the resources that Lynn has referenced in sort of that she's highlighted, but also some of those that she has referenced and linked throughout the presentation under our resource repository section. And so again, there, what we've done is this is intended for a really diverse and broad audience. And so for those of you who may be new to English learner instruction, we have one area where we just provide really basic background on instructing English learners. Those of you who are directly involved in the field might remember this Claude Goldenberg piece that came out a couple of years ago. So we have some resources around broad introduction to English language instruction, English language learner and emergent bilingual instruction. Then we have a second section that has to do specifically with standards-based instruction and focusing on the Common Core state standards, although we're trying not to be too limiting here. And then lastly, what we're trying to really sort of seek out has to do with the intersection of English language learners and Common Core state standards and standards-based instruction in general. So those pieces where we're really getting at that rich intersection of how do we best understand and navigate these new standards, and also maintain English learners both content and language acquisition without compromising either. So it looks like we have a couple more questions that have come in.
Do you want the professional learning design?
Sure. Well, it looks like one of the questions that we have has to do with approaches to professional development. And there are a range of kinds of PD workshops, and some of these are sort of more packaged and more structured than others. You know, I think, again, this gets back to this issue of the fact that all of this is so coming so quickly, and how do we piece it all together and make sense of it. Lynn did mention a variety of different professional development approaches, including GLAD, CALA. At Cal, we work on sort of the SIOP model, which is, again, sort of highly structured and has 8 really clear-cut components and then 30 features within. I think, generally speaking, though, what Lynn was discussing during that slide has to do with sheltered instruction. And so, you know, whether you're in an ELPA 21 state or a different state, and, you know, regardless of the sort of constraints that under which you are operating in your particular context, what's really the highest priority is making sure that kids are getting not only English language but language maintenance as well as content. And so, you know, one of the resources that we have available on the Education Connection site is another publication that in which Cal is describing principles of effective instruction for English learners. And so I think a good rule of thumb is, you know, regardless of the model, is any given model and its delivery, which is to say, you know, it's not a model in and of itself, but it's the trainer who's facilitating, you know, the delivery of that model, as well as the educator who's delivering instruction under that model. You know, do those meet certain sort of basic tenets and principles around what we believe to be effective instruction for English learners, particularly in mainstream settings. Lynn, do you have anything sort of in general to add?
Well, I'm finding lots of PowerPoints with scripts, and the one thing I'm looking through in my search, I just have to make sure they're not you know, owned by a company before I put them, or I have to contact them. But I saw this great one by the Syracuse school district, where they had Lily Wong-Filmer come in, and then they were unpacking it with table talk, and so they were looking at complex text. They were looking at different examples. It was like the classic where you had your shoulder partner, where you were turning and talking about things and debriefing. So I think there are a lot of good designs out there for face-to-face trainings. I think the idea behind these webinars are just building awareness and sharing information about the resources, but I think it's the actual, if you think about where you've really learned things and shifted in your view, for most people that I've spoken with, it tends to happen where you have an experience and you're working through something. Online learning is really hard. It's very time intensive and very hard to do it in that way. Just in terms of setting up this topic, though, usually in the beginning what I'm seeing is folks, you talk about the shifts that are going on, and then from the shifts then you go into looking and unpacking different types of texts and trying to use the tools yourself. It's extremely powerful to try to use the tools. Once I did a Schlepper-Bell workshop, and it was just fabulous because you were actually using the different types of approaches she was using. So I really love her tools. She's really good at what she does. There was a question about the name of the video on the teaching channel that I very much like. I very much like the Understanding Language ones, and the quickest way to get there is actually just go to the Understanding Language website. So you Google Understanding Language, Stanford University, look for the ELA unit, and then from there they should have links that go directly to the teaching channel website. And then in the search I'm doing, we're trying to we'll get that published as quickly as we can. It's probably, we're in the first month of the review of looking at different items, so it's probably going to come out in about 2 months. And the idea is you should be able to look at it and click on it and go right to the sample. So this is great. I love how you're defining what you want, because that send me request, that's fine. Sarah, I'll defer to you.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, part of what we're trying to do with this project, this Education Connections project, is bring together and pool all of these resources for you so that you can just go to one place and find them. And so everything that Lynn has mentioned here, what we'll do is we'll reconnect with her and we will post these materials and we'll have them categorized and organized and cataloged in our resources section. As well, we'll have, of course, the archive of this webinar. And then we also encourage you, after you join up, participate in the professional learning communities. The goal there is to provide a space for you to interact with others who are working in the same context where you are. So working with the same standards in terms of content standards as well as ELP standards. Often there are other initiatives that are going on, whether that's in your particular district, in your particular state. They may have to do with your school or otherwise. So I'll just briefly touch on one last question that looks like it's come in, and that has to do with background knowledge. And so the Common Core has a lot of requirements around independent reading. And so the question has come up a lot, should we build background for students given this requirement of sort of independent work and independent reading? And Lynn, do you want to?
Hold on. Sorry, I was reading Lydia's question. Sorry, I was like, Lydia.
I mean, I think essentially the question is yes. Again, part of what is required with these new standards for the CCSS and beyond is not only that teachers and educators establish an understanding of the text, but that does not negate all of these other pieces. Again, the sort of these underlying principles that we know and we understand have to do with sort of best practices and really solid pedagogy. And so even though it may seem from the outset in terms of as we work on our levels of implementation with the new CCSS and other standards, it may seem as though these are sort of conflicting with the good stuff. Really, at the end of the day, best practices and strong pedagogy do and will endure, even though it may seem differently from the outset. So one of the things we have a couple more minutes. Sure.
And there was a question from Lydia from Colorado, Colorado, and I have to say I just had a blast going through their blog. They have a Common Core for ELLs, and I was looking at it in relation to some work. I was mapping the work they had done in relation to linguistic access for the Common Core for our general search, but I also mapped it for the ELPA 20 ELP standards. And it was just, there was so much on there, and the posting should be coming out soon, mapping the ELPA 21 ELP standards with the Coloring Colorado. So it's a great blog. They have really neat units, and there are just so many resources, writing research questions, looking at effective ways to use the MPIs, reformulating roles, just a lot of fun looking through that. And it's very nicely done, very well written. So let me see. Was there another question?
I think we're just about out of time here. There are a couple more that we may not have been able to get to. We will what we're going to do with these questions is we're going to go ahead, we're going to retain these, and we will address them either via the PLC portion of the Education Connections site. We may do it in a future webinar, or we may do it by compiling resources and posting some of these questions up on our resources page and then providing some of the resources in response to them. We do understand that your time is limited, and we appreciate taking the time with us. So someone had requested that we show, again, Lynn's name and Education Connections access point, so that we've come back to that slide. There's the login page if you'd like to create a profile. Lynn, again, works with WestEd, and my name is Sarah Moore, and we have other colleagues here at Cal who are working on our Education Connections project. And so if you have any questions or comments in addition to this, feel free to access additional points of contact and email through the Education Connections site. And with that, I think we will wrap up for for the day. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Another reminder, the chance to win $100 if you enter our this month's Education Connections lesson plan competition. So last month was really, we were really excited about the feedback that we got and the submissions and contributions. Folks have been using our lesson plan template, which integrates both Common Core, both the Common Core as well as Principles for Effective Instruction of English Learners. And so, again, getting at that intersection is what Education Connections is all about, and we really appreciate all the participation. So with that, we'll sign off. Thank you so much, Lynn, and we'll be in touch with our next webinar in another month or so. So take care, everyone. Best wishes for strong implementation and to stay warm. We'll see you hopefully in warmer months. Bye-bye.